having your own currency is like having an insurance policy on your car. You're paying a cost for it, a premium. And you feel, my goodness, it's a waste of money until you have an accident. Same with your own currency. There is no doubt that your government has been for years now trying to keep a fixed exchange rate with the euro. So people out there can very easily be led to believe that, if we have a fixed exchange rate with the euro, we might as well have the euro, because now that we're not in the euro, we're paying a risk premium, a higher interest rate for borrowing. So why pay this? Well, it's your insurance policy. Imagine what will happen once you join the euro. Your interest rates will fall by a bit. There's going to be a lot more risk-taking, both by Bulgarians and non-Bulgarians. There's going to be, all other things being equal, there's going to be a flood of money into Bulgaria, because let's face it, if you're a Deutsche Bank, right, finance bank, you have excess liquidity, especially during quantitative easing, and you don't know what to do with this money. Because the Germans do not want to borrow this money. Corporations are in surplus. The federal government, structural surplus. Households, save. So there is a glut of money in the financial system in Frankfurt. Now, because of the small risk of a crisis in Bulgaria that would devalue your currency, right? They're not as keen to lend you because they have to take into consideration the devaluation risk, right? When they have the euro, when you have the euro, that goes away. So more money comes in. This is what happened in Greece in 2000. You're going to have bubbles. You're going to have a false sense of growth because of the bubbles. And then if there is, knock on wood, a financial crisis, either in Bulgaria or outside, or in Wall Street, suddenly the easy money will flood out of the country and your bubbles will burst, and then you're going to be in serious, serious trouble. Once you're in the euro, steadily there's going to be a flood of money from German banks and French banks to your banks. Your banks will lend people money. That will create asset price inflation. That will create bubbles. When those bubbles burst, you'll be in serious trouble. So effectively, you're going to be creating a problem for yourselves. And you are going to lose your capacity to... you will lose a major shock absorber, which you only need when there's a big pothole on the road. Now, the pothole will come. And the probability that it will come increases when you enter the euro. So it's a bit like, giving up your currency is a bit like removing the shock absorbers from your car and driving it into a pothole. It is not a very clever idea. Now, there's no doubt that there are very powerful interests in your country, like they were in my country, pushing for euro accession. Because they want their assets to be priced in euros, in dollars, in hard currency. They don't want your little Bulgarian currency. They would like the big assets to be priced permanently with the backing of the European Central Bank in euros. But the majority of Bulgarians are going to suffer for this. In any case, look, I'm not against a common currency. But we don't have a banking union. Okay? There is one only in name, but not in substance. There is no deposit insurance provided by the European Union, by the Eurozone. So your own banks will have to provide deposit insurance. Okay? If you enter, your government is going to be supporting the banks, which are going to be supporting the government, while at the same time the government supporting the deposits of the of savers. Effectively, you will have no protection whatsoever. The possibility of devaluation, a one-off devaluation, which is always a great thing to have, not to use, to have. It's a bit like having an army. You don't want to go to war, but you have an army in case you go to war and in order to prevent a war. So this is the same thing with your capacity to divide you. If we had a proper banking union and a fiscal union, then I would be all for it. I want a common currency. I'm a federalist. I want a federal Europe. But we don't have one. To pretend that we have one because we have a monetary union is the greatest hubris against basic laws of economics. The Eurozone authorities, in particular the Eurogroup, which I happen to know reasonably well, better than I wanted to know it, they show a fantastic capacity to change everything to ensure that nothing changes. This is a great paradox. They will do anything and they will change anything so that nothing changes. So the first thing they did to keep everything the same is they violated the no bailout clause. They created a bailout machine, which then became the EFSF, which then became the ESM. Okay. But that is simply a machine for permanent, perpetual bankruptcy concealment, for hiding a bankruptcy, not for correcting it. So imagine if in the United States in 2008, right, the great state of Nevada did not have access to the FDIC and to the Federal Treasury and to food stamps and to unemployment benefit that is federal. It would be a complete disaster. It would be what happened to Greece, right? Now, how would the state of Nevada be helped if the United States had created a mini IMF, lending money to Nevada on conditions of strict austerity and giving it money on loan in order to bail out their own banks without the capacity to print money? It would be a catastrophe. This is exactly what's happening. So the ESM was an irrelevancy. They created it, but it is irrelevant. The last thing you want if you're bankrupt is more loans, right? Even if the interest rate is zero, it really doesn't help. You need haircuts, you need restructuring of the debt, or you need a proper Eurobond, which Europeanizes the debt. To cut a long story short, look at what happened during the pandemic. The pandemic hits, it's clear that the whole thing is going to blow up. I mean, we're going to have Greek national debt now is 215% of GDP. So it was 14 or 15 prime ministers and heads of state, Macron, the Greek prime minister, Sanchez in Spain, and so on. They asked for a Eurobond for essentially the additional debt due to COVID should be Europeanized, should not fall on the shoulders of Italy, of Greece, and so on. Merkel said 9. So she created the recovery fund, which is macroeconomically irrelevant, just like the ESM is irrelevant, because it does nothing for the Italian debt, for the Greek debt. This is why Lagarde now is in deep trouble, because she has a surge of inflation, right? But at the same time, she's the one that is rolling over the unsustainable debt of most Eurozone member states. And they have this recovery fund, which simply takes money from poor Germans and gives it to rich Greeks. Saying, yes, it is true. At last, we had a Eurobond. Firstly, too little. Just ridiculously insignificant. And secondly, done in such a way as to ensure that the Dutch, the Austrians, and the Germans, I'm talking about the establishment now, not the people, right? Will say never again. So in my view, this is what I'm saying, this is a big question. And here we can disagree, but the big question is, are we moving slowly in the right direction or fast in the opposite direction? And I think, so you claim that we're moving in slow, kid steps in the right direction. I think we're going with great leaps in the wrong direction, because the idea of the Eurobond has been killed off forever now. Because they have practiced it in this particular way, it is really sordid. It's corrupt the way they're doing it. Think about it. It's 5% of GDP, of Eurozone GDP, to go directly into a green energy union, where Europe looks at Europe as a whole and says, okay, we're going to have an energy union, and we're going to invest in it centrally. What is Bulgaria good at producing in terms of renewables? What is Germany? Greece has a lot of sun. The countries closer to the Atlantic have a lot of wind, right? Let's create this and fund it directly, not give it to governments. I know what governments are like. I've been in one for a few months. I do not want European money to go into the Greek government. I would like, the European Union to actually conduct a federal program, if you want, for energy. By giving it to the Greek government, to the Spanish government, to the Italian government, the governments were going to give it to the oligarchs locally, to their mates. Already we're seeing it. It is sordid and it is very unseemly. The Dutch and the Germans who are transferring funds through this Eurobond to the south, look at that. And this, in my view, is the death knell of any proper fiscal union in the future. What would be the right way to do a Eurobond, in your opinion? I proposed that a long time ago, and then again at the beginning of the pandemic. Well, firstly, the bond should be issued by the European Central Bank because it's the only serious institution we have. The European Commission is not a serious institution. Nobody takes it seriously. Okay, it's only if it has the backing of the European Central Bank. So you might as well have the European Central Bank. A lot of people in Brussels will be mad at what you say, but anyway. Tough. What can I do? They don't pay me sufficiently to lie, right? The ECB is the only institution that we have, financial institution, that is solid and dependable. So if I were a Chinese investor, a German investor, a Bulgarian investor, right? And there was a bond issued by the ECB, knowing that the ECB has printing presses, I would buy it immediately, right? And I would not have the member states backing it. Now, this bond that the Commission issued is backed by Greece, for goodness sake. What are we doing? Okay. So essentially, it's backed by Germany. So German conservatives or the liberals are livid about that. And they only accepted it because of the pandemic. But tomorrow, they're going to turn very nastily at the whole idea of a jointly and severally backed Eurobond. Whereas an ECB bond, and so my suggestion was a 30-year bond that would sell at negative interest rates immediately, right? And would fund what? It would fund this cushioning, so the new debt would not fall on the decrepit Italian state, Spanish state, Portuguese state, Greek state. Well, that's one. Secondly, the European Investment Bank, which already issues its own bonds, right? And they issue green bonds. They can issue whatever they want, right? Imagine if they were to fund the green energy union that we need. I insist on this because this is the one thing we can do well at the European Union level. The one thing we can only do at the European level, and the one thing that we really need to do. And you can see with the energy crisis that this is so. So the European Investment Bank could be given the green light. Only takes one session of the European Union Council, to issue 500 billion a year, every year, for 5 years, 2.5 trillion, to fund this big business of the green transition. And Christine Lagarde, all she has to do is to say that I will stand by these bonds in the secondary bond markets. She wouldn't need to print anything because just by saying this, those bonds would sell like hotcakes. So this is something that one of Angela Merkel's top advisors told me once when he heard this proposal of mine. He said, "This is a good proposal." I thought, okay, you are advising Angela Merkel. Why don't you advise her to do it? He said to me, she will never do it. I said, okay, please explain your question. Why not? He said, look, don't you understand? Every time the German Chancellor, Merkel or whoever it might be, walks into a room with the French president, the French president keeps his mouth shut. Why? Because France is a structurally deficit country vis-a-vis the structurally surplus country, which is Germany. To put it bluntly, if tomorrow morning there's an announcement that the euro goes and we go back to our own national currencies, there's going to be a massive flow of money into Germany and out of France. So if you are the French president, right, you keep your mouth shut. In the end, you may kick and scream for a little bit, but in the end, what she says goes. The moment we do in Europe what I suggested, or we create a federation, be a federal treasury, federal bonds, Eurobond, and so on, that ends. because then Germany cannot leave the euro. It's not that Germany wants to leave the euro. Germany is the greatest beneficiary of the euro. Merkel does not want to leave the euro. But in her handbag, she has a get out of the euro card, like in Monopoly, a get out of jail card, that Greece doesn't have. France, the deficit countries don't have. That card gives her enormous asymmetrical political power vis-a-vis the French president. And for me, I'm completely undogmatic. I don't care what governments use as labels. What matters is what people actually do. Right? So, for instance, I don't think, take Britain, which a country I know very well. I don't think that Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, is more left-wing than Boris Johnson. If anything, Boris Johnson is doing things that Keir Starmer wouldn't do in favor of the working class. And this is a tragedy that we have as leftists speaking now. Look, Greece and Eastern Europe, we share a trait. We were seen by the surplus countries, the net exporters of Europe, as a vital space. What we had to offer them was markets and labor markets, as well as a space providing demand for their money. People ask me, why did Berlin accept Greece into the European Economic Community back in 1980 or into the Eurozone in the year 2000? What did Greece have to contribute? What do we produce? A little bit of olive oil, a few oranges. We're corrupt, poor. Why did they let us in? The answer in the case of Greece is not the labor force, because the labor force had already migrated to Germany in the 1950s. The Gastarbeiters, right? I mean, half the Greek labor force built Germany up, along with Italians and Yugoslavs, right?
And Turks.
And Turks. Let's not forget the Turks. No, but what we did have was no debt, which sounds really striking now and strange. But in 1980, the public debt of Greece was 30%, 35%. Private debt, zero. Even in 2000, when public debt had increased a lot during the 1980s and 1990s, even when we entered the Eurozone, the Greeks had no credit cards, no mortgages. I didn't know anybody back in 2000 who owed money to the bank. Because even if you asked for a loan, you wouldn't get it. People would actually work all their lives, and build a house when they were in their 50s or 60s. The idea of getting a loan to buy a house when you were in your 30s, that was completely absent. So what we brought to Deutsche Bank and Société Générale and BNP Paribas was, okay, we were not rich, but we didn't owe money, and we owned our own homes. We were a dream for Western bankers who were, and especially when we got into the Deutschmark zone, the Eurozone, then we were the perfect partners. In the case of Eastern Europe, the countries of the Eurozone, the industrialized countries of the Eurozone, they found ready-made factories. So think of the expansion of Volkswagen and Audi and so on into Eastern Europe. They took over the existing factories, Eastern European factories, and they refurbished them with Skoda and so on. They imported huge quantities of human capital, well-educated Bulgarians, Romanians, so moved to Germany. A colleague of mine at the University of Berlin, of Humboldt University of Berlin, did a study, and he said that it was something like, in his estimation, he calculated the human capital that was imported into Germany since the accession of the Eastern countries was something like 200 billion. The amount of expertise that came cost 200 billion the countries of Eastern Europe to create. And that was shifted. Supermarkets, Lidl everywhere. The development of underdevelopment. So, my country, your country, the countries of the East, we receive lots of money from the structural funds, lots of money. That money usually ends up as aggregate demand for European companies that build the roads, that provide the materials.
Or in oligarchic circles.
Or oligarchic circles. So there is this kind of coalition that perpetuates a very imbalanced European Union. And I'm saying this not as an anti-Europeanist. I'm saying this as a Europeanist. Because this is not the way to develop Europe. Remember Alexander Hamilton. The first thing he said when he became US Treasurer, the first Treasurer of the United States, was we need a common debt, because that will be the common bond that creates the common ethos of the United States. He was completely right. This insistence of not having a Eurobond, of not having a banking union, of doing everything it takes in order not to have a political union. This is what is keeping us apart. And when you are creating, you see, going back to your gradualist tendencies, I said that in the book, I don't know whether you remember it, in the week Suffer What They Must. There are these two schools of thought, the gradualist school and my school, and the one that I belong to, which is not mine, were captured beautifully by François Mitterrand on the one side and Kohl, who were like you know, we do what we can now. We take one step towards union, monetary union, okay, that's what we can do, that's what we do. But there is the other side, Nicholas Kaldor, the Cambridge economist, who in 1971 was warning Europeanists, don't make the mistake of thinking that a monetary union is the first step towards a political union. Because when you create a monetary union, the centrifugal forces pulling Europeans apart will increase, and that will make a political union next to impossible or impossible. It is falling apart. It's already fragmenting. You can see there's a renationalization of almost everything. We now have borders again. We have renationalization of policy, of debt. Debt is concentrated again, Greek debt is concentrated again in the Greek banks, French debt in the French banks. We are having this constant fragmentation. I don't fear, let's not forget Brexit. Brexit is the result of these ridiculous policies in Brussels and in Frankfurt. Okay, first, this supposed clash between markets on the one hand and the state on the other is a fantasy. To begin with, in England, with the Industrial Revolution, without the state, there would have been no markets. Without this king's army to evict the peasants from the land, there would be no commodification of the land, there would be no capitalism. The greatest impediment to freedom and prosperity, from where I'm standing, is concentrated power. Concentrated power, and I think this is something that Adam Smith would agree with, right? Well, not I think, I know. He was completely, aghast at the thought of concentrated power, either market power or government power. Concentrated power in the hands of Jeff Bezos, or a Bulgarian oligarch or a Greek oligarch, is detrimental to our capacity to breathe, to operate, to be creative. Similarly, I don't want to live in a communist regime like the one you had here. I know that if I lived in Bulgaria back in the 1970s and 80s, I would be in the Gulag. There's no doubt about that, right? I can see it from the Greek Communist Party, the way they look at me. I'm the prime candidate for the Gulag. So how can you have markets that work in a way similar to what Adam Smith was suggesting? But remember, Adam Smith was against the existence of public limited companies even, right? Because they would tend to become like the British East India Company. Markets that function, no control from the state, and no oligarchic power. For me, the answer to this is to have businesses that are naturally, as a result of the legal framework of their property rights and ownership rights. Small or medium-sized. Now, you cannot have the state go to Facebook and say, we're going to chop you up into 20 pieces. I mean, how can you do that? You can't do that. Facebook is more powerful than any Senate. But imagine, and this is what I try to do in the book, imagine a situation where we are, people working in the company are partners. Not equal in terms of our voting rights, but not necessarily in terms of our bonuses or our incomes. I don't know whether you've read the book, but I try to...
Haven't still, yeah.
Okay. So in there, I give an example of how you could have a corporation on the basis of one person, one vote, with a mechanism, a voting mechanism, that will allow also for large disparities of incomes, even though we all have equal property rights, on the basis of peer assessment. In the same way in the universities, how do physicists decide who is a good physicist who needs to be awarded the Nobel Prize, right? It's not a state and it's not a market. It's peer assessment. So I was toying with this idea for many years, since the 1980s. But then I had an experience of working in the United States for a year for a company, which actually runs on this principle, and actually saw it work, and it worked magnificently.